purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny.
My name is Howard Thompson. I'm editor of the Texas Atheist newsletter. I'm your host today on Freethought Forum. Today, we're going to be talking about the lost history of Texas freethinkers. Now, this is something that you wouldn't have been taught about in your Texas history classes because it goes to an unpopular subject that many people in Texas would prefer that you don't know about. But some hard-headed, cantankerous freethinkers today are looking to recover that history, and what we find we are beginning to share with people so that they understand there is a heritage of freethinking out there that went before, and people who are freethinkers now and question things now didn't just pop out of a seed pod somewhere, but there is a long history going back hundreds and thousands of years of people asking questions and being skeptical and thinking for themselves. I mentioned that I was editor of the Texas Atheist newsletter. That's a free email newsletter online, and there's a sign back over here. Depending on camera angles, you can probably pick up my email address, and it also has a contact phone number for the show for people who would like to get in contact with other freethinkers and agnostics and atheists and rationalists and skeptics and humanists in the local area. There are 2 local groups available for you. Perhaps the best way of beginning to talk about the history of freethinking in Texas is that all of us do love our freedom. We want as much personal freedom for ourselves as we can have that works in our lives. So freedom is a valuable concept, and we really do like our freedom. One of the things that is necessary for freedom, though, is the ability and the right to think freely and to express yourself freely. This has a long history in humanity of oppressed peoples, people without power, trying to express themselves, find the freedom to think, find the ability and courage to question the dogmas and the ideas and the cultural taboos and constraints of those who have power in society. In particular, for the Texas freethinkers that existed in the mid to late 1800s, they had a heritage link with 18th and 19th century freedom movements. All of you will recall that there was a revolution that founded this country, the United States, that broke out in 1776. There was, for more than 100 years preceding that, a philosophy of ideas and ferment of ideas constituting free thinking in general that preceded that. There was the French Revolution in which Napoleon gained power, and his empire brought free thinking to all of Europe in a sense because Napoleon disestablished state religions, and people were for the first time free to choose not to be religious if they wanted to, and in fact to choose to be anti-religious if they wanted to and speak out against religion. However, when Napoleon's empire collapsed, a number of people did not want to go back to the constraints of the state religions that were reestablished and the monarchies that were reestablished. This discontent ended up in open revolts in 1848, during which time there were people that came to Texas who were freethinkers to join the freethinkers from the United States colonies and frontier states that had come to Texas at that point. I guess a key concept here is that the history of free thinking has really not been lost, such as the title of this show suggests. It's really been suppressed. It's been suppressed by people who don't like to put up with free thinking, don't like to put up with people making their own choices, and don't like to put up with people questioning the rationales and the constraints of those who have power, be they monarchs or secular governments or religions. And we are now trying to recover that lost history of the freethinkers. Now, I've got some slides here today that will help us focus on the ideas as we go through, and hopefully I won't throw any of them on the floor as we go through it. The first thing to go to, I think, is a definition of free thinking. The first person to discuss free thinking was Anthony Collins in 1713 in a book called Discourse of Free Thinking. And by free thinking, he meant the right to think and speak freely in determining the truth and meaning of any area of knowledge, including religion. Now, that last part, including religion, is a key aspect of free thought and free thinking today, because it is this questioning of religion and even being anti-religious in many cases which distinguishes free-thinking philosophies and ideas from other liberal, social justice, socialist types of libertarian and liberty-seeking political movements of the 18th and 19th century. Essentially, there is no real freedom without free thinking, and the right to inquire and speak out is essentially free speech. And this idea is neatly captured over 200 years ago, almost 300 years, by an Englishman who eventually, when his anonymous book was discovered, had to flee to the continent to escape people who wanted to jail him and probably kill him, which is what happened to freethinkers back then. Moving on to the next topic, we need to put free thinking in context in Texas, because free thinking and the free thought movement is not something that just happened in Texas. It's something that happened in the United States, and there was an international movement throughout Western civilization of free thinking with international congresses in Czechoslovakia and Belgium and France during the 1800s, when free thinking was at its peak with its golden age. The free thought movement in the United States had its peak roughly between the Civil War and World War I. There was free thinking before that and a free thought movement before that and questioning of religion before that, and there was certainly free thinking and questioning of religion after that. But it was during this time frame, in particular from about 1870 to 1900, that free thinking, free thought movement in the United States was at its peak. It was part of generally liberal, socialist, and communist, now we're thinking of historical Marx and Engels communism, not Stalin's state tyranny here, before people want a red flag and jump up in the air and holler. Free thinking had connections with these movements, and liberal societies and socialist societies participated in some of the same congresses and meetings that free thinking groups would go to. While there was a fair amount of organized free thinking back then, most of the activity was conducted by individuals who had their own ideas about what free thinking was and questioning religion was. There were a number of magazines. There were people that went around from town to town tent speaking, or if they were more famous and noted like Robert Ingersoll, rented halls and had great speeches that they would deliver against the tyranny of churches and religion and other social injustices. There were actually a number of freethinker towns founded. One is here in Texas, just a few miles west on I-10 from San Antonio, Comfort, Texas, founded in 1854 by the German Texas freethinkers. But also there was a town, Liberal, Kansas, that was founded in the late 1800s, and then also New Harmony, Illinois, was founded as a freethinking town during this golden age of free thought. One of the hallmarks of what happened during this period is there were a lot of freethinker publications. There were newspapers and magazines and literally hundreds of books and even more pamphlets that were published and put out during this time period. But the people who do not like free thinking and do not like people speaking out against religion and examining the truth of religion and questioning scripture in particular, or speaking freely about other things which they think people should not speak freely about or examine freely in society. There was a lot of persecution of freethinkers. There was an obscenity law passed apparently in the early 1870s, a law passed to keep obscenity from being sent through the mails. Well, one of the frequent types of things that would be discussed in freethinker publications was human sexuality and factual descriptions of sexual functions. Now, these were much more muted than what we would see today, very, very mild sorts of things. But there was a postal inspector, Anthony Comstock, which was kind of an earlier Kenneth Starr on a witch hunt, who used this law to arrest literally hundreds and hundreds of people for sending obscenity through the mails. And the free-thinking movement in particular was heavily hit by this. The Truth Seeker magazine, which was founded by a man called Bennett in 1873, he was arrested for obscenity within a few years of the founding of that magazine and served time in jail, which was harmful to his health, and he eventually died from this experience not many years later. Anthony Comstock continued his persecution and arrest for obscenity through the mails. Also blasphemy and sacrilege were among the charges he would add to the obscenity, since free-thinking publications did question religious ideas, some of them in the vein of what we would now consider liberal Christianity, and others outright attacks on the whole idea of magic and gods and Jesus and resurrections and Virgin Marys and the whole bit. Anthony Comstock boasted in the early 1920s, before his death, that he had sent a long, long train of people to jail. The average sentence people served was 13 months. As I mentioned, many people had their health damaged by this. The financial difficulties engendered by this persecution of freethinkers, among others, was such that some people ended up committing suicide. So this is not just an academic sort of passing thing that occurred to freethinking. They were actively, heavily persecuted. One of the noted trials in the late 1870s was the trial of Charles Reynolds, who was an ex-Methodist minister who would go from town to town passing out Freethought pamphlets and speaking from his tent. Sometimes he would run into mobs and get run out of town. But he was eventually charged in one state, I believe it was Massachusetts if memory serves, with blasphemy and arrested. And he was defended by Robert Ingersoll. And Robert Ingersoll offered basically no legal defense and no witnesses. He just got up and gave what was a long closing statement in defense of free speech. Well, the judge in this case was a little smarter than most other judges, and he when the jury came back with a guilty verdict, which is what a jury was going to do back then because only believers pretty much were allowed on juries, he sentenced Reynolds to a $25 fine and court costs total of $53 and let the thing get aside. But for the 6 to 9 months leading up to this trial, this became kind of a show trial, a sensational trial such as we're familiar with today, that had headlines in many newspapers across the country. A large crowd was attracted to it, and it became such a center of discontent that it got a lot of publicity for free thinking, and really helped the movement out in a sense, because it rallied people to the idea of free speech, if nothing else. The free thought movement in the U.S. did come to an end in World War II, roughly. It ran out of steam. The persecutions by Comstock had basically worn people out. There weren't younger people to follow on, and it was pretty much killed off in late 1919 and 1920 when A. Mitchell Palmer, the then Attorney General, exercised power when then President Wilson was sick in the closing days of his term of office. He arrested thousands of people as subversives. This was the first really big Red Scare. Attorney General Mitchell wanted to run for public office, and as part of this persecution, a number of people who were freethinkers were also caught up in it because they supported labor movement and socialist ideas, and a number of them were foreigners, particularly Germans, so they were harmed by this kind of death knell, death blow at the end of the golden age of free thought. But we move on from the U.S. free thought movement. I probably spent a little too much time on that, but let's get to Texas, where most of us can think about it and get close to home. As I've mentioned, the 1900s had their social justice movements that were upset with state religions and monarchies. There were the revolutions in France and Germany and Austria and Italy. One of the things the rulers did to handle dissent was to encourage people to leave the country and go somewhere else. In 1848, the European revolutions, the year or two leading up to that and afterwards, was a time period when 20,000 Germans, the 48ers, came to Texas. And they settled in Sisterdale and Castell and Cypress Hill, Tusculum, Burney, and in 1854 founded Comfort. Now, there were a lot of other German towns founded in Texas during this time period. The ones I'm mentioning are those that are most strongly associated with freethinking. There were freethinkers also in the San Antonio area and in New Braunfels and Fredericksburg. But the towns I mentioned were those that were most strongly associated with freethinking, in particular Comfort in 1854. Most of the historical focus that we've had recently in the area on freethinkers has been on the intellectual freethinkers, but there was also a labor workers movement of freethinking that was more socialistic and much more interested in social justice for workers and much concerned about the abuses of capitalist industrialists who would basically try to force horrible working conditions and low wages on workers. So there was a two-pronged kind of freethinking. There was an intellectual freethinking that came from the universities that has gotten a little bit of mention in local history recently, but then there was also a socialist labor movement, freethinking of the working class that was part of this, and they worked hand in hand many times and had many similar ideas and shared ideals. Now, in addition to the German freethinkers that settled in the hill country nearby, I wanted to mention the non-religious aspects of these freethinkers. In 1854, there was a songfest, I think, if I'm translating right and remember, which is sort of a convention gathering of Germans in San Antonio in 1854. Now, this is the same year that Comfort was founded. And as part of this gathering convention, they got together and passed some resolutions. And these resolutions give you a pretty good idea of what the intellectual German freethinkers were up to at that time. They passed resolutions against slavery because freethinkers did not believe in enslaving other people. They had resolutions against religious instructions in schools, against preachers as teachers, against Sunday and prayer day observance laws, against religious oaths, and against opening Congress with prayers. And they also passed a resolution for a graduated income tax. Now, these are very liberal, forward-thinking, free-thinking ideas for the day. It gives you a pretty good idea of what the intellectual leaders and the intellectual teachers of the German colonists, if you will, were thinking and doing at that time. Comfort as a freethinker town was established without churches, which is something that almost all little towns started first when they had their settlements. There were no religious services. They were unfamiliar with prayer books and hymn books, according to later evidence. And they didn't have a church until 40 years or more after the town was settled, giving you an indication that these people, whatever else they were thinking, they were not at all happy about religion and glad to have religion out of their lives and went to great steps to keep religion from their lives. In the True to the Union ceremonies, now the True to the Union monument out in Comfort is where the remains of freethinkers and other Germans who settled in the hill country were killed when they were trying to flee during the Civil War from Confederate soldiers, because a number of the counties out in the hill country were declared in rebellion against the Confederacy for organizing Union societies. They were against the secession of Texas from the Union. There was a battle fought in Nueces, on the Nueces River in 1862, and after the war, those remains were gathered in Comfort. And the two ceremonies that were held at the True to the Union monument, there was the internment ceremony when the bodies were initially buried, in which there were Union soldiers there firing their guns as part of the ceremonies. And then later, when the monument was completed, there was another ceremony. Both of these were reported in Harper's Weekly magazine from New York. And neither ceremony is mentioned with any ministers present or any prayers or any sorts of religious observances. and given the day, if such had occurred, we know they would have been mentioned. So it pretty much establishes the non-religious nature of Comfort, Texas, and the Hill Country Freethinkers. And then one last thing is the reputation of freethinkers in Comfort among evangelicals. This is a quote from Presbyterian missionary Reverend W.H. Buchanan, published in 1889, so it relates to some time period previous to that. Quote, "Then I set toward Comfort, an infidel town of 600 with no church building or religious services, whose boast was they had none and were determined not to have any." So very clearly, the anti-religious and non-religious nature of free-thinking and free thought in general was reflected in the freethinkers of Comfort and the free-thinking German settlers who did come to the Hill Country and other towns in Texas. Now, it wasn't just the Germans in the Hill Country and the other Germans who were involved in free-thinking. There were other anti-religious freethinkers in Texas. Now, this is still the late 1800s, and it's a time when biblical criticism and examinations of the Bible by biblical scholars was well underway for 75 or 100 years already, and there was already a lot of skepticism building in academic biblical scholars for the magical claims of the Bible, the consistency or the internal inconsistencies of the New Testament, and people were, for the first time, able to read books and hear discussions about the difficulties with the magical stories in the Bible and how Christianity was formed and when the New Testament books might have been written in a wide variety of sources. This had a great impact upon many ministers, including a number of ministers in Texas, a few of whom I will mention. And there was a Baptist minister who was a leader in getting the Baptist church established in Texas, Henry Renfro, who went to Baylor University and graduated eventually from Baylor University, who was active in the Cross Timbers area. And he preached for a number of years, actively, about 30 years, and then in 1884, because he was reading some of this critical biblical scholarship and questioning for himself, he began to mention some of this in his sermons, which upset the more conservative elders in his congregation. And eventually they held a trial for him, or what can be accurately described as a trial, for the infidelity of heresy and not believing that the scriptures were completely inerrant. And he was kicked out as minister, and fellowship was drawn, meaning he was basically excommunicated from the Baptist church. Now, Henry Renfro, in public statements, denied that he was an unbeliever of any sort, but very clearly he had grave doubts about the accuracy of the Bible. He was questioning things in the same way an agnostic or an atheist would, and even his attempts to keep this as mild as he could and keep it within bounds that would be acceptable to his church were made by him. It was not sufficient. He died a short time after that. He became ill, so we have no idea where his thinking would have gone after that and what might have happened in his life. But he's an example of how free thinking and questioning ideas can impact some of the best and brightest of any religion, and he was certainly one of the leading lights of the Baptist church in Texas at that time. There was a doctor in 1875, Dr. Levi Russell, from Heidenheimer in Bell County, who founded an association of freethinkers of Bell County. He was expelled from the Masons and the Knights of Pythias for heresy. In 1877, he was set upon by a mob of KKK, Ku Klux Klan, or Christians, and given 100 whips tied to a tree and left to die. He survived that. There was a Methodist minister, J.D. Shaw, in 1882 who spoke out and was kicked out of his church. He established a secular church in Liberal Hall in Waco, Texas, which was burned in 1889. There was William Cowper Brand, who founded a newsletter, The Iconoclast, that had 90,000 circulation with all sorts of anti-religious kinds of remarks. He was unfortunately racist, but in 1897 he was set upon by a mob of Baylor students and beaten and then shot down in the streets of Waco in 1898. So there is history out there for Texas, for freethinkers. I don't know how much history there is because there hasn't been much real effort expended in recovering it. But we can know that our ancestors and the people who founded Texas fought for our freedoms and spoke out very courageously. We know how difficult it is today to tell people you don't believe in God and speak out for atheism. We've had experiences with that recently just in Comfort, Texas. And we can imagine how much worse it was to speak out and how much more courage it took at a time when it could get you beaten, it could get you kicked out of your job, and it could get you killed. Free thinking is an unpopular sort of thing. Atheism is an unpopular sort of thing, so it gets suppressed out of history. People who later become to be believers don't want people going around finding information that their ancestors might not have believed, or their ancestors might have questioned the religion that they now believe in. But I believe that the history is out there waiting for us to go look for it. It's out there in newspapers. Some of them will be German newspapers. It will have to translate. They'll be out there in legal records and court cases that are still in county courthouses. They'll be in private correspondence that families have in their hands if they have not destroyed it to try to hide that history of their family. This is something we can recover, and it's important for us to recover this lost history of the Texas freethinkers because we need a connection. All of us, whether we believe or don't believe in God or regard ourselves as freethinkers as not, we need a connection with people who had the courage to be skeptical, to be rational, to question, to think for themselves and look for the evidence and not just accept what is passed down to them that serves a power structure which may or may not be benevolent and good for humanity. It's important for us to know that we're not alone, that we're not the first to question, not the first who thought for ourselves, not the first to cast off popular orthodox ideas, whether they be religious or economic or some other sorts of philosophical structure. It's important for us to understand that one of the most vital things that we can do for ourselves and do for humanity is to have the courage to think for ourselves and to open up our minds and to judge for ourselves and to question for ourselves and to make up our own minds. Because a belief that we adopt from others without thinking is a meaningless belief. A belief that we adopt from others is not thinking. It's not even a belief in a sense. It is mere obedience and submission. And I know that all of us, no matter how much we may act submissive or obedient to popular cultural ideas and powerful people in society who can harm us if we speak out against them, we would like the right to think freely. We would like the right to be able to question. We would like the right to be able to speak out and express ourselves and not have to keep ourselves hidden. Well, that's pretty much it for today. You've been watching the Freethought Forum. This is on San Antonio Public Access Television,
this right I
Thursdays at
must
6:30.
treasure.
My
I hope you come back
thoughts
with us
will
again
not
and see you later.
cater
Thank you very
To
much for
Duke
joining us.
or dictator, no person can deny